Hello and welcome to the program. I am Daniel Makwakera coming to you from Kigali, Rwanda. This week we follow the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Mr. Tony Blair, who has just taken up an unpaid position of being the advisor to the President of Rwanda, President Paul Kagame. Mr. Blair, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk about that. You're here in Rwanda and you have taken this position. Why Rwanda?
Rwanda's undergone the most traumatic time, obviously, because of the genocide that was here. It's then rebuilt itself as a country. Britain, when I was Prime Minister, played a significant part in helping that process. And the President of Rwanda is someone I've got a lot of respect for, a lot of time for, and I think he has got a vision for the country now, but wants help in building the capability within the government to implement that vision.
How much do you know already of Rwanda, and have you scanned the terrain, as it were? The reason I ask this question is I'm trying to understand on which areas you think you could be helpful in.
Well, I think what the Rwandans have done, and in part with the help of the donor community, including and prominently Britain, is to draw up a strategic vision for the country. And they've now got that. And they've published that strategic vision. And it's a good one. I mean, it's got exactly the right priorities for them in terms of changing their economy, attracting in private investment, transforming their public services, education and health, creating the right circumstances of social and political and economic stability. However, they've now got to do it. And they do it against a background in which they've made a lot of progress in the last few years. But still, for example, large numbers of people have not access to proper drinking water. Electricity costs are 2 to 3 times the amount of surrounding countries. They've got a situation where the private sector is too small to sustain the country for the future, and they've got a rising population. So I think the government here sees this as now a whole new level of challenge that they're undertaking, and they're interested in how they strengthen the processes and capability of government to make that challenge doable, to make the vision implementable.
How then do you do that? Strengthen the government institutions?
You have to strengthen the institutions of government. You have to make sure that, for example, there's the right capability around the president to take the right strategic decisions, monitor them, evaluate them, see them through. There's a very specific area of private sector investment that the President and I talked about, and where he wants help in getting the investment in. I mean, they've got a tea and a coffee industry here, but they need big infrastructure work done in their main services. They want to develop information technology. They've got various elements of manufacturing, but it's at a very, very low level. And, if you compare it with, for example, Johannesburg and South Africa, I mean, you can see the distance they've got to go.
Now, enter yourself with what the backdrop you've given us. How then can you practically help?
Well, I think in practical terms, because I've been, through a lot of these types of challenges, one of the things this is why I will work with Rwanda, I'll probably work with some other governments as well. I think there is a missing bit of the development issue. And, I trebled aid to Africa in my time. I, made big moves forward at an international level to increase aid, debt relief, and so on. And all of that is really important. But for a lot of governments, what they need is that strategic capability at the center that's capable of taking and implementing the big decisions. And what the donor community does is fantastic in budget support, in helping with various ministries and so on. The NGOs do great work out in the field. But actually, sometimes you need someone who sat on the other side of the desk and taken these decisions to give support to the key decision maker who's then having to implement the vision that's been set out. And that's a different sort of thing altogether. There is all the difference in the world between someone who comes in as a consultant and gives you advice, but has never actually done the job, and someone who's done that type of job and gives you the advice.
What are you bringing is influence, if I hear you right?
Well, it's not simply influence, although I hope to do whatever I can to attract private sector investment in here, but it's also saying, look, if you have this vision, then there's no point in just articulating it. You've also got to have the levers of power around you that allow you to implement it. So, for example, if you want to attract greater private sector investment in, yes, here is a good program that's been drawn up for you by the various international institutions about what you need to do to attract more private sector investment. But you've now actually got to get that done. And here are the ways that maybe you can really make that happen.
So are we talking capacity, or in this case, the lack thereof?
Yes, we're talking about capacity, capability, about making sure that you have the right capability around you to implement the vision that you have. That's the key to it.
Now, from what you know right now, capacity is lacking in Rwanda as far as around the leadership,
they've come an amazing way in the past decade. But yes, I mean, you would have to say that if you look at their strategic policy-making capability, they're very, very dependent on the donor community.
But that's not going to end tomorrow, is it?
No, it's not going to end tomorrow, and neither should it end, actually, but it should be complemented by a capability at the centre of government too.
We're talking overhauling, would you say, maybe?
Well, I don't, part of this is to have a dialogue where, I'm not trying to come in and tell people how to run their country, because it's for them to run their country. But, for example, how you make sure that we prioritise out of the vision that's been set out. What are the real priorities the president wants to focus on? How do we get those implemented? That is going to be an important part of this. How do we attract the right private sector partners in? Obviously there's a certain range of contacts and knowledge that I have about that may be useful.
How do you?
Well, if you're Prime Minister of a country like Britain for 10 years, you make a lot of contacts. And it's partly utilising that to help, but it's partly also, having a conversation that you kind of can't reduce to a paper, if you like, but is about understanding the complexities of the problems that he's dealing with and how the decision-making might be improved to get it right. So, for example, it's very important that the relationship between the president and the way the cabinet process works is right. Now, these are things that, obviously, having done a job like this for 10 years myself, I've got a certain experience in. So I'm not, look, I don't pretend I'm coming in to sort of transform the country. It's the president who's transforming the country. But I think there's certain things I can help in.
But would you say, because it's a different kind of governance system, the UK and Rwanda, where it's a republican, you have a president, whereas you're a prime minister, and I think some people towards the end they started calling you you're acting like a president when you're a prime minister. Is it the same?
Well, here's again the fascinating thing, because I spend a lot of time in different parts of the world. This issue to do with government and its capacity. Of course, a country like Rwanda is totally different from a country like Britain, totally different, as you just pointed out rightly, from South Africa. And both of us are different from the US or China, right? But because the world is changing so fast, governments are having to change as well. They're having to adapt in their processes, in their decision-making, in the speed with which they implement things. And whether it's a president or a prime minister, unless you have the capacity at the centre to take the decision and drive it through, you can't get things done. So, I know when I was Prime Minister of the UK, people used to criticise me because I would take power to the centre and really push the system to get things done. But frankly, that was the only way to get things done. It's the only way things ever do get done. And if you're not careful...
Is it autocratic?
No, I don't think it's autocratic, because I think there's a proper democratic process behind it. But I think you elect a decision maker to make decisions. You don't elect them to continue the debate about the decision. At some point, you elect them to make the decision. And I think that, interestingly, whether it's out in the Middle East, where I spend a lot of time at the moment, what I see here in Africa, this for me for a long time has been something that I think has been a crucial missing component of the whole picture.
What would you say to people who might turn around and say, we think Mr. Blair sees that Rwanda does have a blueprint for itself, and really it's probably an easier job than probably going to Somalia and say, I'll help you come out of your quagmire?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think that's a fair point. But if I was asked to do something, which is a step back from that, in other words, what is the vision for the country, I'd be happy to help in that too. But I don't think you'd be in Rwanda and not say there are big challenges, mind you. So, but this is, when I did the Africa Commission, and when I was the president of the G8 and we did the big push on Africa, I put governance and capability at the center of that then. That's a few years back. And that was because I could see that if you're not careful, you can pour in the aid to African countries. But if the capability is not there on the ground amongst the people in the country, not outside donors who come in and fly out again, but if the capability is not built around the key decision makers and in the government, then you can have great aspirations and the international community can pour money in in support of them, but nothing ever gets done. Now, this is the key, and we all know this. And it's no different, incidentally, when you're trying to push through health service reform or education reform in the UK. It's just on a different scale and at a different level. But that capability issue is there, and it's there. The work I'm doing with the Palestinian government at the moment is all about their capability. They've had billions of dollars poured into Palestine. But without the capability there to use that money wisely, to build their economy in the right way, to build their social infrastructure, it doesn't make a great deal of difference in the end.
Assuming you get the job done with the president and yourself and the support networks in the country, in Rwanda, and you now have that in place, what would you say are areas of priority where you then would say, now that you have capacity in place, A, B, C, D should be top on the agenda?
I mean, I think here it's very much what they've set out in their vision. It's about improving enrollment in education and getting secondary education up to scratch. It's about health and dealing with some of the diseases that are there. It's about electricity and water, because these things are vital, actually, for health and for schooling. And of course, it's about developing the economy. Now, I think those things are reasonably obvious, as it were, in terms of the prioritization, but I think they're also very, very big challenges. And I think if you are able to get that capacity, you're just going to get things done quicker and better.
How long do you plan to stay in this capacity?
I mean, I'd do it as long as the president finds it useful. But we'll start off for a few months and let's see. And it's a kind of new thing for, President Clinton has made a big contribution to Africa through his foundation in the last few years. And that's his way of doing that. And you've got Bill Gates and others, and Bono and others who, and I've done a lot of work in terms of trying to raise the profile of Africa and so on. I'd like to add this as a new dimension of work, because I do, but we're still sort of feeling our way a bit on it, but I think there's a far bigger part of the picture that is to do with this issue of governance and capability than has been recognized up to now. And I tell you the other thing that I'm very keen on as well, because you feel this in a place like Rwanda, but you also feel it elsewhere in Africa. There is a new generation of African leaders and young people, and by young people I mean sort of under the age of 50, actually, be generous on that, who are grateful for the help that comes from the outside world. But you know what? They look forward to the day when they're not reliant on that help, because they want to stand on their own 2 feet, and actually they're just as clever and just as bright if they get the opportunities as anyone in the Western world. So that's the other part of it for me. The thing that I always found unsatisfactory about the traditional aid relationship was that it was very paternalistic. I mean, it was well-intentioned, but it was very much, we are the donors, you are the recipients, and here it is. Here is our largesse.
Here's the prescription.
Yeah, and here's the prescription. And you get people who come in and they give the leadership of the country a prescription that was, I mean, an ideal world maybe, but in utopia maybe, but not in the reality that they faced.
I think some people would say that might be changing now with China and India rising. The question would be, aren't you thinly spread, progressive panel, the Africa Commission, and also you're with the quartet in the Middle East?
Yeah, there's always a danger of that, but so far I'm managing to work, and obviously, I'm putting a team of people in as well. So I don't want to exaggerate what I can do at all, but I think if the president finds it useful, and as I say, someone I've got a lot of respect.
Positive about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you mentioned, just maybe in the ending, you mentioned that this is a new thing, and you are a leader that has left office, and as you might know, we might have a dearth of that as far as the African continent is concerned. How does one adjust after being in power for that long? How do you adjust to a new life, or have you adjusted? You seem okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's difficult, but I reckon these jobs are so pressured nowadays that 8-10 years is about enough. It's exceptionally, that is a different case, but I think one thing that is quite sensible, though, is for the world to think how it uses the accumulated experience. I mean, look, there are lots of people who disagree profoundly with a lot of the decisions I took, and there are lots of things that I did wrong as well as right. But I knew a lot more when I finished than when I started. And I think, for people who've occupied these positions, I think there's also a new thing that's coming, because a lot of us are coming out of office rather younger than previously. Why not use that experience? I mean, like Kofi Annan is doing in Kenya now, like Bill Clinton's done with his foundation. It's not sensible not to use that experience. And so the other thing I think that's quite interesting about this is it possible when someone leaves office to have an impact even after they've left? You kind of think, right, that's it, you're retired, you're out of the scene. Well, you are in one sense, but in another sense, if you can focus on particular issues and use your experience to help resolve them, then maybe you can carry on making a contribution. And sometimes I think that contribution can be considerable. I mean, I would say that Bill Clinton's probably made, I think he'd probably say this himself, maybe a bigger impact on Africa since leaving office than when he was in office. So there it is.
I suppose you have to have left office on a good note, as it were. We have to leave it there, Mr. Tony Blair. Thank you very much for having been my guest. That's where we leave it for this discussion, coming to you from Kigali, Rwanda. Till next time, goodbye and good night.